I stood at the edge of what used to be my peaceful 10-acre property, staring at something that made my stomach drop to the ground. 90 houses. 90 perfectly manicured suburban homes with white picket fences, driveways, and mailboxes, all sitting on land that I had owned for 15 years. The land that I had inherited from my grandfather. Land that I had never permitted to anyone to build on. The worst part was not just seeing my property stolen. It was watching families with children playing in yards that were supposed to be mine. It was seeing an entire neighborhood thriving on land that belonged to me. The HOA had not just taken my property. They had built an empire on it and collected millions in fees from innocent families. As I watched a woman water her garden where my old oak tree used to stand, I realized something that would change everything. They had made the biggest mistake of their lives. I had been gone for 8 months. My mother had fallen seriously ill, and I moved across the country to care for her during her final days. When she passed away, I needed time to handle her estate and grieve properly. My 10 acres of beautiful rural land sat waiting for me back home. At least, that is what I thought. The drive up my old gravel road felt different immediately. There were street signs where none had existed before. Maple Lane, Oak Street, Willow Drive. My heart started racing as I turned the corner, expecting to see my small farmhouse and the rolling fields behind it. Instead, I saw something that made me slam on my brakes so hard that my car skidded sideways. Houses everywhere, not just a few houses. An entire subdivision with curved streets, sidewalks, and decorative lamp posts. Children were riding bicycles on paved roads where my wildflower meadow used to bloom every spring. A woman was walking her dog past a fire hydrant that sat exactly where my grandfather had planted his prized apple orchard. I sat in my car with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of horrible nightmare. But the longer I stared, the more real it became. Someone had built an entire neighborhood on my land without asking me, without even telling me. I drove slowly through the streets, reading house numbers and street signs like I was touring a foreign country. Every turn revealed more houses, more families, more evidence that my property had been completely transformed. At the center of it all stood a large wooden sign that made my blood boil with rage. Welcome to Meadowbrook Estates, a premier planned community managed by Meadowbrook HOA. I parked my car and walked up to the sign with my phone, taking pictures of everything. My hands were shaking so badly that most of the photos came out blurry. A man jogging past me stopped and smiled. "You thinking about buying here?" he asked cheerfully. "Great neighborhood. We moved in about 6 months ago." I stared at him, unable to form words. 6 months ago, I was sitting by my mother's hospital bed. 6 months ago, this was still my empty land. "Actually," I managed to say, "I think there has been some kind of mistake. This is my property." The man laughed like I had told him a funny joke. "Oh no, buddy. This development has been here for almost 2 years. My neighbor over there was one of the first families to move in. You must be thinking of somewhere else." 2 years. While I was working 60-hour weeks to support my sick mother, someone had stolen my entire property and built a town on it. The jogger waved goodbye and continued on his way, leaving me standing alone next to the sign that announced the theft of everything my grandfather had left me. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed on the HOA management sign. A cheerful woman answered on the second ring. "Meadowbrook HOA, this is Jennifer. How can I help you?" "I need to speak to someone immediately about this development," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This entire neighborhood is built on my property without my permission." There was a long pause. Then Jennifer laughed in the same way the jogger had laughed. "Sir, I think you might be confused. This is a fully permitted development that has been operating for over 2 years. All of our paperwork is completely in order." "I own this land," I said more firmly. "I have the deed. I have been paying property taxes on it for 15 years. Sir, I am going to need to transfer you to our legal department. Please hold." As the hold music played in my ear, I stood surrounded by houses that should not exist, on land that belonged to me, feeling completely powerless. But that feeling was about to change very quickly. The next morning, I sat in the office of Patricia Williams, the attorney my neighbor had recommended for property disputes. I spread my grandfather's original deed, 15 years of property tax records, and dozens of photos across her desk. Patricia studied everything with the careful attention of someone who had seen similar cases before. "This is definitely your land," she said finally. "The legal description matches perfectly, and your chain of title is clean, but I have to warn you about what we are facing here." She pulled up the county records on her computer and turned the screen toward me. The Meadowbrook development had been officially approved 3 years ago. The HOA had been incorporated as a legal entity. 90 families had purchased homes and were paying mortgages to banks. "The problem is not proving that you own the land," Patricia explained. "The problem is that these people bought their homes in good faith. They have title insurance. They have legal protections. Even though the original developer committed fraud, these homeowners are innocent victims too." My heart sank as I began to understand the complexity of what I was facing. This was not just about proving ownership. This was about unwinding a multi-million-dollar development that had been operating for years. "What about the developer?" I asked. "What about the people who actually stole my land?" Patricia's expression grew more serious. "Pinnacle Development Group. They filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago and dissolved the company. The original partners moved to different states. Getting money from them will be nearly impossible." She explained that our first step would be filing an emergency motion to stop any further sales or construction. We would need to notify all the homeowners about the ownership dispute. We would need to request a complete title search and survey of the entire development. "How much is this going to cost?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be devastating. "Conservatively, $50,000 just to get started. If this goes to trial and appeals, we could be looking at $200,000 or more, and that is if we win." I felt sick to my stomach. I had spent most of my savings caring for my mother during her illness. I was facing the fight of my life against an established HOA with deep pockets, and I was already at a financial disadvantage. 2 weeks later, I sat in a courtroom for my first hearing. The HOA had hired Morrison, Fletcher, and Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in the state. Their lead attorney, Richard Morrison, wore a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. "Your Honor," Morrison said smoothly, "my client has been operating this development in full compliance with all local regulations for over 2 years. Mr. Thompson's claims are not only baseless, but his attempt to disrupt an established community of 90 families borders on harassment." I watched in amazement as Morrison presented a thick folder of permits, approvals, and documentation. Everything looked official and legitimate. If I had not known better, I would have believed that the HOA had every right to build on my land. When Patricia stood to present our case, she seemed small and outnumbered compared to the HOA's legal team, but her voice was strong and clear. Your Honor, Mr. Thompson has owned this property for 15 years. He has paid taxes on it continuously. No one has ever contacted him about selling or developing this land. The permits and approvals that my opposing counsel has presented were obtained fraudulently, using forged documentation. The judge studied both sides' evidence for what felt like hours. Finally, he spoke. This is clearly a complex property dispute that will require extensive investigation. I am granting a temporary restraining order preventing any further sales or construction on the disputed property. However, I am not ordering the removal of existing structures at this time. Morrison immediately stood up. Your Honor, my client respectfully requests that any restraining order be limited in scope. These families have invested their life savings in these homes. Disrupting their peaceful enjoyment of their property would cause irreparable harm. The judge nodded. The restraining order will not interfere with current residents. Mr. Thompson, you will need to provide substantial evidence of fraud if you want this court to consider more drastic remedies. As we left the courthouse, Patricia tried to sound optimistic, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The HOA had won the first round by positioning themselves as protectors of innocent families. I was being painted as the troublemaker trying to destroy a peaceful community. That night, I sat on the porch of the small apartment I had rented near my stolen land, staring at the lights in windows of houses that should not exist. Somewhere in that neighborhood, families were having dinner, children were doing homework, and people were living their lives on property that belonged to me. I had two choices. I could walk away and let them keep what they had taken, or I could fight back with everything I had, even if it destroyed me in the process. The decision was easier than I expected. Nobody steals from my family and gets away with it. I spent the next 3 weeks becoming an expert in property records, development permits, and construction timelines. My dining table disappeared under stacks of documents I had requested from the county, the state, and every government office that had anything to do with the Meadowbrook development. The first breakthrough came when I discovered something that made my hands shake with excitement. The environmental impact study for Meadowbrook had been filed 14 months before my grandfather died. Someone had been planning to steal my land while he was still alive, still living in his farmhouse, still tending his apple orchard. I called Patricia immediately. They knew, I told her. Someone knew my grandfather was sick and started the paperwork to steal his land before he even passed away. Patricia asked me to bring everything to her office immediately. When I arrived, she was already on the phone with someone from the county planning department. Mr. Johnson, she said, I need you to pull the original application for the Meadowbrook development. Specifically, I need to know who signed the landowner consent forms. She put the phone on speaker so I could listen. After several minutes of searching, Mr. Johnson came back on the line. Here it is. The landowner consent was signed by Robert Thompson on March 15, 2019. My blood ran cold. Robert Thompson was my grandfather's name, but my grandfather had died on January 8, 2019. Someone had forged his signature 2 months after he was buried. Mr. Johnson, Patricia said carefully, can you fax me a copy of that signature page immediately? 20 minutes later, we were staring at a document that proved everything. The signature was nothing like my grandfather's careful, shaky handwriting that I knew from birthday cards and letters. This signature was bold and confident, written by someone who was definitely not a 92-year-old man with arthritis. But the forgery was just the beginning. As we dug deeper into the development timeline, we discovered that Pinnacle Development had been in financial trouble long before they started building on my land. They had borrowed money from multiple investors, promising returns that were impossible to deliver. Patricia hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to help us trace the financial connections. Marcus was a former FBI agent who specialized in fraud cases. Within 2 weeks, he had uncovered a web of corruption that went far beyond simple land theft. Your property was the solution to their problem, Marcus explained during our meeting at his office. Pinnacle had promised investors that they would develop a premium subdivision, but they could not afford to buy land at market prices, so they decided to steal yours. He showed us bank records that revealed the true scope of the fraud. Pinnacle had collected over $4 million from investors who thought they were buying into a legitimate development project. They had sold lots to families for an average of $80,000 each. The HOA had collected another $2 million in fees and assessments. The total fraud is approximately $12 million, Marcus said, and your land was the foundation that made all of it possible. But the most shocking discovery came when Marcus traced the connections between Pinnacle Development and local government officials. The county planning director who had approved the environmental impact study was married to one of Pinnacle's investors. The city council member who had voted to approve the development permits had received a $25,000 campaign contribution from Pinnacle's parent company. This was not just fraud, Marcus told us. This was organized crime involving multiple levels of government corruption. Armed with this new evidence, Patricia filed an amended complaint that named not just the HOA, but also Pinnacle Development, 3 government officials, and 2 banks that had provided financing despite knowing about the title problems. The response from the HOA was immediate and vicious. Morrison, their attorney, filed a motion claiming that I was harassing innocent homeowners and trying to destroy their community with frivolous lawsuits. He requested sanctions against me and my attorney for filing what he called malicious and unfounded accusations. But then something unexpected happened. A woman named Sarah Chen called Patricia's office and asked to meet with us privately. Sarah had been the assistant to the president of Pinnacle Development. She had been laid off when the company went bankrupt, and she was angry about losing her job without severance pay. I kept copies of everything, Sarah told us during our meeting. I knew something illegal was happening, and I wanted to protect myself if anyone ever asked questions. She handed us a flash drive containing hundreds of emails, financial records, and internal documents from Pinnacle Development. The evidence was devastating. Email conversations showed that company executives knew they did not own the land. They had discussed the risks of getting caught and decided to proceed anyway. One email from the company president to his business partner was particularly damning. The old man is dead, and his grandson lives across the country. By the time anyone figures out what we have done, we will have sold all the lots and disappeared with the money. Another email discussed bribing local officials to expedite the permit process. A third email revealed that they had purchased fake insurance policies to convince banks that the development was legitimate. As I read through Sarah's evidence, I felt a mixture of rage and satisfaction. These people had not just stolen my land. They had planned every detail of their crime, celebrated their success, and assumed they would never face consequences. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The hardest part of this entire nightmare was not fighting the lawyers or uncovering the fraud. It was looking into the eyes of families who had innocently bought homes on my stolen land, and realizing that justice for me might mean devastation for them. Patricia had advised me to avoid contact with the homeowners while the case was pending, but I could not help myself. I needed to understand who these people were and what this community meant to them. So I started taking long walks through the neighborhood in the evenings, observing the life that had grown on my land. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had moved from a tiny apartment into a two-bedroom house where she could finally have a garden. I watched her tend to roses that she had planted with her own hands, talking to them like they were old friends. This was probably the first home she had ever owned. The Patel family had 3 young children who rode their bicycles on the safe streets and played in the small park that had been built where my grandfather's barn used to stand. Mr. Patel worked 2 jobs to afford the mortgage payments. Mrs. Patel told neighbors that this house represented the American dream for their family. Then there was David Chen, a veteran who had used his military benefits to buy his first home after returning from deployment overseas. He had installed a flagpole in his front yard and raised the American flag every morning at sunrise. His house sat exactly where my grandfather used to park his old pickup truck. One evening, as I stood at the edge of the development taking pictures for my legal case, Mrs. Rodriguez approached me. She had noticed me walking through the neighborhood several times and was curious about who I was. "Are you thinking about buying a house here?" she asked kindly. "It is a wonderful community, very safe and quiet." I looked at this sweet woman who was probably in her 70s, who had finally achieved her dream of homeownership, and I felt sick to my stomach. How could I tell her that her dream was built on my family's stolen land? "Actually," I said carefully, "I am dealing with some legal issues related to this development." Her face immediately changed to concern. "Legal issues? What kind of legal issues?" I explained as gently as I could that there was a dispute about the land ownership and that I was working with attorneys to resolve it. I assured her that my goal was not to hurt innocent homeowners like herself. Mrs. Rodriguez stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the fear growing in her eyes. "Are you saying that we might lose our homes?" "I am saying that the people who sold you this house may not have had the legal right to sell it," I answered honestly. "But I want to find a solution that protects families like yours." That conversation haunted me for days. I began to understand that the real victims of this fraud were not just me, but also the 90 families who had invested their life savings in homes that might not legally belong to them. The HOA board, however, was not interested in protecting anyone except themselves. They sent a letter to all homeowners claiming that a disgruntled individual was trying to steal their homes through frivolous lawsuits. They organized a community meeting to defend their neighborhood against my baseless attacks. I decided to attend that meeting. Patricia strongly advised against it, but I needed these families to hear the truth directly from me, not filtered through the HOA's lies. The community center was packed with angry homeowners when I arrived. The HOA board president, a man named William Hayes, was already speaking when I walked in. "This individual thinks he can come into our community and destroy everything we have built together," Hayes was saying. "He wants to take away your homes, your children's schools, your entire way of life." When Hayes noticed me entering the room, he pointed directly at me. "There he is, the man who wants to make your families homeless." 90 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me with mixtures of fear, anger, and confusion. I had never felt more alone in my life. But I also knew that these people deserved to know the truth about what had been done to them. I raised my hand and asked to speak. The room erupted in angry voices, but Hayes eventually called for quiet. "I want you all to know," I said, my voice shaking, "that I am not your enemy. We are all victims of the same crime." The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source. 3 months into the legal battle, Marcus Webb called me with news that made my heart race with excitement. "I found him," Marcus said. "James Patterson, the former president of Pinnacle Development. He is living in Arizona under his real name, working as a real estate agent like nothing ever happened." Marcus had been tracking Patterson for weeks, following a trail of financial records and employment applications. Patterson had assumed that dissolving his company would make him untouchable, but he had made the mistake of using his Social Security number to get licensed as a real estate agent in his new state. "Better yet," Marcus continued, "he is broke. The bankruptcy was real. He spent all the money he stole from your land and is now living paycheck to paycheck selling houses in Phoenix." This news was crucial because it meant Patterson might be willing to cooperate in exchange for avoiding criminal charges. Patricia immediately filed a motion to compel his testimony and began preparing subpoenas for his financial records. But the real turning point came 2 days later when Morrison, the HOA's attorney, made the biggest tactical error of his career. During a deposition, Morrison was questioning me about my knowledge of the development timeline. He was trying to prove that I should have known about the construction earlier, and that my delay in filing suit was evidence that my claims were not legitimate. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison said condescendingly, "are you seriously asking this court to believe that you had no knowledge of a 90-home development being built on your property for over 2 years?" "That is exactly what I am saying," I replied calmly. Morrison leaned back in his chair with a smug expression. "And I suppose you also expect us to believe that your grandfather never gave permission for this development before his death." "My grandfather died in January 2019, I said. "The landowner consent form was signed in March 2019. Morrison froze. For just a moment, his confident facade cracked, and I saw panic in his eyes. He had just admitted in a recorded deposition that he knew the consent form had been signed after my grandfather's death. He knew about the forgery, which meant the HOA knew about the forgery. Patricia and I exchanged glances across the table. Morrison had just destroyed his client's case. After the deposition, Patricia was practically vibrating with excitement. "He just admitted knowledge of the fraud," she said. "The HOA can no longer claim they were innocent victims who relied on legitimate documentation." We immediately filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the HOA's knowledge of the forged consent form made them co-conspirators in the fraud rather than innocent purchasers. The response from Morrison's firm was swift and desperate. They filed an emergency motion claiming that Morrison had misspoken and requesting that his statement be stricken from the record. But it was too late. The damage was done. Meanwhile, Marcus had been working with federal investigators who were now interested in the case because of the interstate nature of the fraud and the involvement of government corruption. The FBI opened an official investigation into Pinnacle Development and its connections to local officials. The pressure was mounting on all sides, and cracks began to appear in the conspiracy. Sarah Chen, our whistleblower, received a threatening phone call telling her to stop cooperating with our investigation. Instead of intimidating her, the threat made her angry enough to provide us with even more evidence. She gave us copies of insurance policies that Pinnacle had faked to convince banks to provide construction financing. She provided evidence of cash payments made to government officials in exchange for expedited permits. Most importantly, she gave us recordings of phone conversations where company executives discussed their plan to abandon the project once they had collected enough money from lot sales. The local media began paying attention to the story after Patricia issued a press release about the FBI investigation. The headline in the county newspaper read, "Local HOA under investigation for land fraud." Television news crews started showing up at HOA board meetings. William Hayes, the HOA board president, held a press conference to deny all allegations and attack the credibility of our evidence. But his performance was unconvincing, and he looked like a man who knew his world was collapsing around him. The final blow came when James Patterson, facing potential federal charges, agreed to testify against his former business partners and the HOA board members who had knowingly participated in the fraud. In his sworn affidavit, Patterson admitted that the entire development had been built on stolen land. He confirmed that HOA board members had been aware of the ownership problems from the beginning. He provided details about bribes paid to government officials and fake documents created to fool banks and insurance companies. For the first time since discovering the theft of my land, I felt like I was winning. The courtroom was packed on the morning of our final hearing. Word had spread throughout the county about the land fraud case, and local media had been covering every development. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia, watching as Morrison and his team arranged stacks of documents in what appeared to be a desperate last stand. Judge Martinez called the court to order and looked directly at me. "Mr. Thompson, this case has presented some of the most serious allegations of fraud I have seen in my 20 years on the bench. We are here today to determine not just property ownership, but whether justice can be served when crimes have been committed at multiple levels." Patricia stood to present our opening argument. Her voice was strong and confident as she laid out the evidence we had gathered over months of investigation. "Your Honor, this is not a complicated property dispute. This is a criminal conspiracy that involved forging documents, bribing officials, and stealing $12 million from investors and homeowners. Mr. Thompson's land was the foundation that made all of this fraud possible." She presented the forged landowner consent form, pointing out the obvious differences between the fake signature and samples of my grandfather's real handwriting. She showed the court emails from Pinnacle executives admitting they knew they did not own the land. She played recordings of phone conversations where company officials discussed their criminal plans. Morrison's response was desperate and unconvincing. He argued that even if fraud had occurred, the current homeowners were innocent purchasers who deserved protection. He claimed that removing them from their homes would cause more harm than justice. "Your Honor," Morrison said, "my clients purchased their homes in good faith. They have title insurance. They have invested their life savings. The court cannot destroy an entire community based on the actions of a dissolved development company." But Judge Martinez was not buying it. During his questioning of Morrison, the judge's frustration was obvious. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that your clients had no knowledge of the ownership problems, when the evidence clearly shows that board members were aware of the forged documents?" Morrison stumbled through his answer, trying to distance the current HOA board from the original developers. But Patricia was ready with evidence that several current board members had been involved with Pinnacle from the beginning. The most dramatic moment came when James Patterson took the witness stand via video conference from Arizona. He had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and he held nothing back. The entire development was built on land we knew we did not own, Patterson testified. We forged the old man's signature because we needed his consent to get the permits. We knew it was illegal, but we thought we could sell all the lots and disappear before anyone discovered what we had done. Under questioning from Patricia, Patterson revealed that HOA board members had been present at meetings where the fraud was discussed. He testified that they had received kickbacks from lot sales in exchange for their silence and cooperation. William Hayes knew from day one that we did not own the land, Patterson said, looking directly at the HOA president who sat in the gallery. He helped us forge documents and lied to homeowners about the legitimacy of their purchases. Hayes jumped to his feet, shouting that Patterson was lying to save himself from prison. Judge Martinez ordered him removed from the courtroom. The testimony continued for 3 hours, with Patterson providing details about every aspect of the criminal conspiracy. He named names, provided dates, and described exactly how the fraud had been carried out. When Patterson's testimony ended, Morrison had no effective cross-examination. His client's case had been completely destroyed by their former business partner's admissions. Judge Martinez recessed the court for 30 minutes to review all the evidence. When he returned, his expression was grave and angry. This court finds that the Meadowbrook development was constructed entirely on land belonging to Mr. Thompson through a criminal conspiracy involving fraud, forgery, bribery, and corruption, the judge announced. The evidence of wrongdoing is overwhelming and undeniable. He ordered the immediate dissolution of the Meadowbrook HOA and appointed a special master to oversee the transition of the property back to my ownership. He awarded me damages of $2.4 million for the fraudulent use of my land and ordered the HOA to pay all of my legal costs. Most importantly, Judge Martinez referred the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution of all involved parties. As the judge's gavel fell, I felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. After more than a year of fighting, justice had finally been served. The people who had stolen my family's land were going to face real consequences for their crimes. Morrison gathered his papers quickly and left the courtroom without making eye contact. But I could see the defeat in his shoulders as he walked away. Outside the courthouse, Patricia and I were surrounded by reporters asking for comments. I kept my statement simple and direct. Justice has been served today. No one has the right to steal someone's property and build an empire on it. I hope this case sends a message that fraud and corruption will not be tolerated in our community. 6 months after our court victory, I stood on my reclaimed land watching the last of the HOA infrastructure being removed. The fancy entrance sign with Meadowbrook Estates had been replaced with a simple wooden post marking my property boundaries. The decorative street lamps had been taken down, and the paved roads were being broken up to restore the natural landscape. The aftermath of our legal victory had been swift and comprehensive. William Hayes and 2 other HOA board members were arrested within a week of the judge's ruling. They were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Hayes was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The other board members received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation with prosecutors. James Patterson, despite his cooperation with our case, was also prosecuted for his role in the original fraud. He received 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay restitution to all victims of his crimes. The corrupt government officials who had accepted bribes to approve the fraudulent development were also brought to justice. The county planning director lost his job and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The city council member who had taken campaign contributions from Pinnacle was convicted of bribery and banned from holding public office. But the most satisfying justice came when federal investigators seized all of the assets that had been purchased with money stolen from my land. Hayes lost his expensive house, his luxury cars, and his boat. The money was returned to victims of the fraud, including the innocent homeowners who had been deceived by the conspiracy. The homeowners themselves faced a difficult transition, but I worked hard to ensure they were treated fairly throughout the process. With help from the court-appointed special master, we developed a plan that allowed families to recover most of their investments through insurance claims and the restitution fund created from seized assets. Many of the families were able to purchase homes in legitimate developments nearby. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman I had met during my evening walks, received enough money from the settlement to buy a small house with a garden just a few miles away. The Patel family used their settlement money as a down payment on a larger home in a better school district. David Chen, the veteran, was initially angry about losing his first home. But when he learned the full story of how we had all been victimized by the same criminals, he became one of my strongest supporters. He now works as an advocate helping other veterans avoid real estate fraud. The financial settlement from the court case allowed me to restore my land to its original beauty. I hired a landscape company to remove all traces of the development and replant native trees and wildflowers. Where 90 houses once stood illegally, meadows and forests are growing again. I decided to build a small memorial garden where my grandfather's farmhouse had been located. It features an apple orchard planted with descendants of the trees he had tended for decades. A simple stone marker tells the story of how he homesteaded this land and built a life for his family through honest work and determination. The legal precedent set by our case has helped other property owners fight similar fraud schemes. Patricia has become a recognized expert in development fraud and frequently speaks at conferences about protecting landowner rights. Marcus Webb has been hired by the FBI as a consultant on real estate fraud investigations. As for me, I have found peace in knowing that justice was served and that future victims will be better protected because of our fight. The criminals who thought they could steal my family's legacy and escape consequences learned that some people will never stop fighting for what is right. Every morning, I walk through the restored meadows where my grandfather once farmed and my family's history lives on. The land remembers who truly belongs here, and now the law does too. Sometimes the good guys really do win in the end.